Warner Brothers is out of touch. After successfully launching Hogwarts Legacy back in 2023, which has gone on to become the best-selling game of that year, and mind you, a non-Rockstar or Call of Duty game being this best-selling game of the year hasn't happened since We Play back in 2008, to now, where Suicide Squad has launched in early 2024 to middling scores and a dwindling player base. Surely the conclusion that Warner Brothers should be drawing from this is that AAA single-player games do have a market and do sell well if given the proper care, and that live service games, without unique propositions in gameplay, live events, or otherwise, simply do not have the stickiness to break into that large and very cemented market with games like Fortnite, Warzone, Apex Legends, and more. And yet, we see comments from Warner Brothers leadership that suggest that AAA single-player games are going to be less of a focus going forward for them, and they will be moving away from that towards more live service efforts and mobile. During a recent Morgan Stanley speaking event, Warner Brothers and Discovery gaming boss J.B. Perrette discussed some of the company's strategy for their gaming division going forward. Quote, "We're doubling down on games as an area where we think there's a lot more growth opportunity, that we can tap into the IP that we have, and some of the capabilities we have on the studio where we're uniquely positioned as both a publisher and a developer of games." He continues, "Rather than just launching a one-and-done console game, how do we develop a game around, for example, a Hogwarts Legacy or Harry Potter that is a live service where people can live and work and build and play in that world in an ongoing basis?" Now, Suicide Squad isn't the first game Warner Brothers has tried to launch into live service to middling success. Gotham Knights, despite not being an exclusively live service game, had a lot of co-op and live service elements within it, and it's clear that the game at one point was probably thought of as a live service evolution of what would have been previous Arkham games. That game did sell well on the single-player side, but as far as player counts and continual updates, the game never really saw the kind of success you might want to see in a live service title. And now it's very obvious that with Suicide Squad, the game has underperformed massively, speaking during its recent financial results to the disappointment that Suicide Squad has brought on, simply not living up to what they hoped for the game to be. It's obvious that Warner Brothers was hoping that Suicide Squad would be a live service game that, while maybe it didn't immediately gain a lot of market share, could cement itself as a strong alternative to other games like Fortnite and Warzone for players looking to exist and live in the DC world with those characters, and to slowly attrition in more players as the game improved and had content updates. This, of course, is not happening. In fact, I would be surprised to see Warner Brothers continue to support this kind of game even beyond the next 12 to 16 months. They obviously have a plan for the first year of content, but beyond that, nobody knows. And given the sales and given the dwindling player base numbers, it seems unlikely that they're going to continue to invest in that game. So why is this troubling? In a market where we've seen companies like Microsoft and Sony, EA and Ubisoft all continue to chase this live service dragon, a type of forever game, a game where you launch it, gain a player base, sell them continuous microtransactions, and continually update the game for years to come, transcending console generations and transcending platforms altogether. It's the kind of perfect product you would want as a publisher of games. A continual revenue stream that you simply must maintain with core gameplay on top of your established player spending strategies. I've obviously simplified the concept, but to break into this sector of gaming is no joke. Fortnite became what it is today almost by happenstance. They had developed the mode outside of the traditional single-player co-op defense-based gameplay of the base game, and games like DayZ and PUBG sort of took off on their own, and games like Warzone and Apex followed suit. All these games sort of got in early. They offered gameplay that was unique in the form of Battle Royale. Warner Brothers and Suicide Squad didn't really offer anything unique besides the characters. There hasn't really been a live service game in the DC universe before. Games where you can take on the role of Harley Quinn or Killer Shark, Deadshot, or Captain Boomerang. The setting was unique, but the gameplay appeared very generic. Despite delaying the game a year, nothing really seems to have changed since their initial reveals back in 2022 and 2023. Warner Brothers successfully launched a single-player AAA Harry Potter game with a mostly open world despite not being maybe as large as something like, say, Grand Theft Auto, to rave reviews and rave success even despite the controversy mired around the principal IP's author. The game has since sold 22+ million copies. It's one of the best games of all time just by sheer numbers, and no doubt made Warner Brothers a lot of money. If anything, you would think that being the trustful stewards and carefully crafting a video game in the likeness of the original IP, with care and concern for all the different minutiae that might come with something as intricate and something as beloved as Harry Potter, would lead you to believe that making more of those types of games would be the right move. But no, Warner Brothers seems to see this as sort of an outlier, and to an extent they're correct. Large games like this don't often come around where they sell 20+ million copies. But single-player games do sell quite well on all platforms. It's really just a matter of how much care and how much time and attention you give to the game. Now, obviously, there are other factors like release window, who you're releasing against, the type of game you're making, but ultimately, quality most of the time wins out. It seems to me Warner Brothers is simply drawing the wrong conclusions from the last 17 months of sales across their two largest games in Suicide Squad and Hogwarts Legacy, and making a judgment call on what they expect to be investing in going forward based on these two titles, despite what I believe being a massive misread on their part. Aside from the fact that people are tired of new entries in live service, given what likely is already time commitments on many people's parts to existing live service games. It is also a mismanagement of expectations. Rocksteady is known for making traditional single-player AAA games. From Arkham Asylum all the way to Night, these games were beloved for their ability to make you believably live in that world. They took time and attention to craft the games around the existing IP, less fan service and more respect for the fans and people who loved the world and the characters involved in it. And when Suicide Squad got released, I think part of the reason the game failed from the beginning is because people just didn't expect or want this game. After Arkham Knight, I think many people expected that there might be a follow-up game or another single-player game in a different DC property like Superman in years to come. And while that never happened, we did get Gotham Knights, which did have single-player elements and did have some single-player AAA leanings. The game was clearly not crafted in the same vision as, say, Arkham City or Arkham Knight. And then years later, after developing Arkham VR, in comes Suicide Squad. It is tangentially related to the Arkhamverse despite having a lot of Elseworlds elements into it. And rather than playing in a single-player world with any of these characters, it's simply a live service shoot-'em-up with generic weapons and generic gameplay. Part of the reason people are tired of live service games is because of a lot of the pitfalls that come with it. Live service games require, at minimum, large amounts of time invested per week to stay up to date with the different gameplay systems and gearing systems that a lot of them accompany. They usually feature a lot of repetitive gameplay, where continually repeating the same missions over and over again with little variation becomes the norm. And almost certainly, the biggest issue of all, they're almost always filled to the brim with microtransactions far exceeding what most people might consider reasonable in a world where games still cost $70 at release. Warner Brothers' read here on the situation just seems like a company that's more so speaking to what it believes the trends will be going forward, and less to speaking towards its strengths. Hogwarts Legacy's success should have immediately greenlit something like a Hogwarts Legacy 2, and I think we may still see that, given the monumental success of that game. And my hope, despite seeing the failure of a game like Suicide Squad, which almost certainly will lead to layoffs at the development studio Rocksteady, that they might read the failure of this as the market telling them they just aren't interested in this kind of game. Now, it's entirely possible it's the wrong property for this kind of game. We've seen games like Warframe, Destiny 2, Rainbow Six Siege, Overwatch 2, all come into saturated markets and continue to be mainstays in a lot of social circles with live service games. Even games like Valorant from Riot, despite having the large backing, it is simply impossible to ignore that there's a success there in being able to jump into a crowded market and cement yourself as a mainstay. Still, the hope is that Warner Brothers would have seen the failure of this game and read it for what it was, that the market is simply not interested in this kind of game from Rocksteady or this kind of game at all. What seems to make more sense to me is rather than invest another $300+ million in a single-player Arkham game, to maybe get a smaller team at Rocksteady working on a single-player Batman title with around a $100 million budget that can have realistic sales expectations and forecasts. I think people are still clamoring for single-player games. Hogwarts Legacy should be proof of that enough to Warner Brothers. But if they don't believe that that's not a fluke and that that simply is the perfect storm of conditions that led to that game's success, they can look no further. Elden Ring in the last year and a half also climbed over the 20 million sales mark. The game is massive. And while From Software has a reputation that precedes it with regards to game quality, which no doubt helps juice those sales a bit at launch, they're not the only outlier. Resident Evil 4 Remake in the last year also has had strong sales. And actually, Resident Evil is a great example. Look at the success of Resident Evil's single-player iterations versus their multiplayer ones. Resident Evil games have always been sold off the back of its strong narrative single-player experiences. I don't expect that Warner Brothers will shift away from this strategy. Live service games are still lucrative, and they still are the sort of pie-in-the-sky dream that every publisher hopes to achieve. And while I don't blame any of these publishers for going after this goal, it simply needs to be in moderation and with consideration for what else they should be developing and delivering for players. Capcom delivered Exoprimal, which obviously got a large boost of money from being available on Game Pass day one, but it's clear that that game didn't really deliver in the way that they might have hoped as a live service game. And yet Capcom knows not to simply throw the baby out with the bathwater and completely lean into that sort of genre as its future. Games like Dragon's Dogma 2 come out later this month. We know that future Resident Evil remakes and Resident Evil mainline series entries are coming from Capcom as well. I don't expect any of these publishers to stop driving and working towards making a live service game. I don't even think it's necessarily the wrong move, but live service games to me simply mean that the game is going to become a colossal success or it's just going to wither away and die almost immediately. If Suicide Squad doesn't pick up over the next year of content, it's highly unlikely that Warner Brothers is going to continue to invest money in it to build it up into something that might become successful in the way that maybe Bungie has with Destiny 1 and 2 after both games having failed to sort of launch in very refined and polished states. People do want single-player games alongside live service. You just have to treat them with enough care and respect for the player's time and money that they'll show up. They clearly did that with Hogwarts Legacy, but with Suicide Squad, it's clear that they didn't. Ultimately, I think Warner Brothers is sort of doomed to repeat the mistakes a lot of publishers have. They're going to continue to chase live service and mobile trends, where I think they'll have some middling success with some of the titles, but none of them will really reach the height that they were hoping for. Developers at these different studios who are given this directive will see layoffs, further weakening the studio's ability to deliver high-quality games in the future that might have been more successful had they been born from a more carefully selected genre. and that eventually Warner Brothers will realize that trying to compete in an overcrowded market with juggernaut games that have sort of cemented themselves as these staples in gaming, and especially within that sort of live service area of the market, is a fool's errand, and one that they ultimately are not cut out to do. And that eventually they may pivot back to what they've seen success with in the past, in worlds only they can make given the IP ownership rights that they have with games in the DC universe and Harry Potter. And that ultimately the last few years of their efforts in live service will have been a waste of time and money. That's going to do it for me, guys. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.